Good morning.
Good morning, David. Hello. Welcome to this week's episode of Challenger Network News. I'm Syed Bukhari, a partner with Elixirr, and we have a very interesting topic to discuss today. There's no secret that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digital transformation. But what has it done to retail store design? And what is the role of retail spaces in the future? That's what we're talking about today with David Faulkner, Global Head of Retail Store Design and Transformation at Bose Corporation. Welcome, David.
Hey, how are you? Nice to be here.
Thank you, David. David, let's just dive right in. As the second surge of the COVID-19 pandemic is upon us, I just read an article recently, and Dr. Fauci is saying, well, in the US, we may not have lockdown, but to brace for pain and suffering, right? A lot of executives are taking those signals and what has transpired of the past 18 months as a signal that it's a no-brainer to go digital first, to go digital only. So to kick us off, David, what's your position on that? Do you agree or do you disagree?
So I would disagree. And what I think has been a big issue for lots of retailers and lots of companies has been to think of digital as a standalone and then think of person-to-person retail as a standalone. I think that there's a big difference between the separation between B2C and regular kind of retail sales. So B2C is totally different type of customer. But with physical and digital retailing, you're going to the same customer. They're the same person. And so combining those or thinking of those as levers that you have to sell to customers, to acquire customers, and to create lifetime relationships with customers, look to the strengths of each.
Well, David, when you look at what's been going on, there's a general consensus or a popular opinion that behavior has shifted, fundamentally shifted, and has gone away from retail store sales, retail store foot traffic is down, et cetera. From your understanding, and I know you've been crunching numbers, what has actually been the impact on retail stores during the pandemic?
So let's step back a little bit further because I think context is important. Online sales have been rising relatively slowly, but rising sort of year over year, measured against themselves quite rapidly. If you think of the percentage of retail sales, and I'm looking at the Census Bureau data, at the height of the pandemic, online sales were about 23.5% of total retail sales, excluding auto and gas. And that's not very much. I mean, I think everybody would have perceived they would have been 100%, right? But people were still going to stores, buying all the toilet paper in the world and other things. And so there's a place for person-to-person sales in the formula, no matter whether you're in the perfect storm for online, which the lockdown was, or not. The other thing is that non-store sales have gone down since the height of the pandemic, and traditional retail sales have rebounded to almost the levels they were 5 years ago. People got excited to get out and go to stores. So I think if you unpack that and say, why do people go to stores versus shopping online? Mm-hmm. You'll start to get some usable intelligence that you can utilize for your roadmap going forward.
Look, David, that's very interesting. Actually, to your last point, if we start thinking about the behaviors that haven't shifted in the way that we expected it to, however, you mentioned that why are people going to retail stores? General excitement. Some luxury retailers call it revenge purchasing. But as you think about that, how is the role of the retail space actually changing? Because I still don't see it as being the same. Like when I go to the store now, I'm not looking just to get a quick transaction. I'm more interested in like touching, feeling, maybe demoing a product. Yep. Am I different, or is that is that the future of retail spaces? Tell me a little bit about what your thinking is in that.
Well, I think that one of the things that's happened is, in business, we always talk about the objective function of any kind of action, right? So if you think about that from the consumer's point of view, what's the elements of the value chain that consumers experience in store that they just can't get online? So you talked about touching, feeling, but I actually think advice is one of the big elements. So if you know what you want, if you know you want a Samsung earbud, then you can buy it online. You already know exactly what you want, right? So you don't need any advice, you don't need any help, just buy it online. However, if you think you want some earbuds to use on your Zoom calls, you may want to go someplace where folks know a little bit more about it that you do, and that where you can ask open-ended questions, right? You can't do that online. The customer experience online is super scripted, has a narrow set of choices that you may not understand or may not match up with your questions. But in a store, people can delve deeper, they can use natural language, and get the advice they need. From the retailer's perspective, you can also steer customers a little better because you can smile, you can be affable, you can do things that a website can't do. And so in terms of retailers who are showcasing a new product, for example, they can do that more effectively and create a kind of halo effect by making the in-store customer into an advocate for a particular product or brand. And it's hard to do that online, particularly because, and we forget, most online sales are through a third party like Amazon. So Amazon is advocating the sale, not the brand, right? So you're not going to be able to have as deep or rich a brand experience through most online.
And branding is a really important, component of that, as is customer experience you just mentioned. If I'm building a business case that I'm an executive, what objectives, so thinking more internally, what objectives and business objectives is it having that retail space actually serve for me that's different than what maybe in the past, what those objectives have been?
Well, I think that, again, and we have talked earlier about leveraging the in-store experience as kind of an amplifier, not a distribution endpoint, right? So if you start to think about the retail store experience and its place in your total consumer sales kind of toolkit, think about it as an influencer of folks, not as a transaction-based endpoint. And when you start thinking about it that way, it fits right into what has changed. People, during the pandemic, people still went to stores and they risked their lives, right, to go to stores. I mean, it's crazy. But one of the things that I found is the conversion ratio was through the roof, right? During the pandemic, if they went to a store, they were going to buy something. So how can you recreate some of that, focused activity, that kind of sales in that environment, and say, how do you take all the goodness out of that and then start to scale that into a retail experience that you leverage differently? And real estate is a big part of that. Do you really want to be, I think that are mall locations delivering what they used to? Maybe the high street is something that you want to consider. Do you want to be in places that people are when they're not shopping, just in case they have a few minutes and could come in? Do you want to create more of a showroom or an event space instead of a retail store? And part of the formula I use is, if you can use your transactional sales to just break even on the cost of having a store, not necessarily make a profit, and then leverage the rest of the store facility for selling and creating long-term customers as a marketing element that costs you nothing, right? even less than a billboard if you break even, then you've got a new strategy for your store that is more in line with the way people behave and shop today.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, David, and very insightful. If I apply that, and we both have a background in banking as well, if I apply that to banking, and you mentioned, trust, brand, advice, those are typical reasons why bankers have used to justify the existence of their branch networks. But we've got people out there, for example, Brett King, who has been saying for years that banking is not a place you go. A bank is not a place you go, but banking is something you do, right? And he's always been advocating for digital banking and getting rid of branches. So if you two were on an elevator together, what would you tell him, or what do you wish Brett knew, or what you wish he understood that you understand?
Well, I've only read a couple of Brett's, I think 5 books that herald the complete obliteration of the bank branch. But I would tell him he's really missing the point, along the same lines I mentioned earlier. And Movin, the company he heads, sells digital banking to banks. So I understand he has a vested interest. But if you think about it, transactions are things that digital does great. And you go back to the 1950s when I think it was Bank of America first sort of initiated the magnetic reader of checks to process them faster for themselves and for customers. Technology has been part of banks, especially computers, for decades and decades. And there's no reason for it to stop improving or reducing the friction, as a lot of people said, of the transactional part of banking experience. But when you need to get a loan, and I think there was this millennial disruption report by a group called Scratch a number of years ago that said that millennials would rather go to the dentist than talk to a banker. You found that was because most of them were pretty young. When they started turning 35, they visited bank branches more than anyone else because they need some advice. And there's kind of a threshold. If you're going to have a credit card where you're borrowing maybe up to $10,000, right, in a revolving way, you could just get that online. It's just a vehicle, right? But when you start to do a $700,000 loan for a house, you want that trust that is better engendered in a person-to-person interaction than it is in an online interaction.
Absolutely. David, this has been an excellent conversation. Thanks so much for your insights and your knowledge and data in this area. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks. It's been great speaking with you.